Now, let me tell you all about our presenter today. Matter of fact, as I talk about our presenter, I'm going to put one more poll up, a poll that actually Jane asked about. Where is it? Does your organization provide training regarding access online? Okay, let me tell you about Jane. Jane Jarl, PhD, is the President of Disability Compliance and Career in Online Learning. Jane received her BS and Master's of Science degrees from Purdue University and her PhD from Wichita State University. Her academic preparation was in the area of speech, I got to learn to talk, speech language pathology. She was a full-time faculty member at The Ohio State University in speech language pathology for 7 years, then served for 14 years as executive director of the Association on Higher Education and Disability. Since 1996, Jane has been a private consultant working in the area of disability in higher education. 3 years ago, she formed this company, Disability Compliance and Career in Online Learning, working to focus the attention of the burgeoning segments of the higher education community on issues of access and equity for students with disabilities. So before I turn it over to Jane, let's take a look at the poll. Interesting one. 63%, 85% of you voted, and 63% do provide training regarding access online. Excellent, excellent. So let me put the results away and put the desktop and turn it all over to Jane. Jane, take her away.
All right, thank you very much, Steve. Let me get my PowerPoint up here to look at. And is that showing up right?
That is. There you go.
Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It's interesting that so many of you do in fact have online training available regarding accessibility for online issues for your campus community, and I'm saying campus because obviously most of the folks are in higher ed. It will be interesting to hear after the fact, to hear from some of you as to whether the training and the information that I'm providing here was useful in a new context, or whether, as I think you may find, I've got a slightly different view of how that training all fits together. With that having been said, let's start out by talking about why we're having this conversation. When we talk about the legal mandates that impact on accessibility issues in higher education, or in public and private sector at this point in time, but especially higher ed, the first question that comes up from folks who know much about online and legal issues is, what about Section 508? Section 508 is Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and there is a lot of confusion within the community as to whether Section 508 applies to colleges and universities. The answer is it doesn't. Section 508 requires website access and usability for people with disabilities, including those who are using assistive technology, for government websites, generally the ones that end in .gov. The Section 508 regulations do not apply directly to higher education or to the K-12 system for that matter either. There are some states that have chosen to adopt the Section 508 guidelines for any state entity. And if you are in one of those states, then you may be subject to the Section 508 regulations in a second-hand kind of manner. But Section 508 of the Rehab Act really only applies to the government's websites and to their interaction online. All right, then what about the Americans with Disabilities Act? Surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, the Americans with Disabilities Act came about in 1990. 1990 was long before we knew much, if anything, about the Internet, and certainly long before there was anything significant happening regarding online education. That being the case, then, as you may not be surprised to hear, there is nothing in the Americans with Disabilities Act that pertains to access to lessons and to the online learning environment for persons with disabilities, except in general terms. The laws say you may not discriminate against a person with a disability in any of your programs or activities, and your online learning environment is part of your program or activity at this point in time. So certainly it covers, the Americans with Disabilities Act covers what we're doing online, but it isn't very specific. In fact, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1974 is really the law that speaks most specifically to what it is that colleges and universities, and again, K-12 systems for that matter, are required to do in order to make sure that there is access for their online education units accessed by people with disabilities. Why Section 504? If it came about in 1974, that was before the Internet was even a glimmer in Al Gore's eye. The bottom line is that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act says if you receive any money from the federal government, if you have funding from the federal government at all, and for those of you at the college level, if you have a single student going to school on a Pell Grant, you are considered to be a recipient of federal funds. Section 504 says you may not discriminate on the basis of disability. You may not deny someone the access to, the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity provided by any institution receiving federal financial assistance. Again, your programs, your activities, your online education is really just an extension of the education that you have been providing on campus for all these years. And just as your on-campus classes were required to be accessible to qualified students with disabilities, so too are your online classes. Steve and I had an interesting discussion yesterday as we were setting this up, and just briefly, when you are talking to other people about accessibility of your online component, if someone tells you that the system they're using is 508 compliant or ADA compliant, you need to ask more questions, because that would suggest that they're not really sure what it is you're looking for, and or they have no idea what those terms mean. The term ADA compliant in the context of online education is virtually useless, because the ADA doesn't say anything specifically about online. The term 508 compliant may have utility, again, depending on what your state rules are, or if your institution may have chosen to use 508 as its basic operating system, or as its basic benchmark for accessibility. But even at that, it's not going to give you a great deal of information about how usable your educational programs are to persons with disabilities. You want to know whether students with disabilities can fully participate, and reference back to the statutes won't tell you that. You're going to have to do some looking. So let's talk about how we do that. Isn't access to online learning all about the technology? When you first get into discussions about online access, the focus always seems to be on, well, have we put things online in a way that is accessible? Have we mounted things in the right code so that somebody who is using a screen reader or some other kind of accessible or some other kind of technology can easily get in and read what's there? Technology and assistive technology and the match of that technology, in other words, does what the user has to work with the system that's in place, or is the system very workable for anybody who's got the latest version of JAWS or whatever screen reader, but if you've got an older version, you can't get in even though the accessibility was there. All of those issues of technology and technology match, they're all important, but they're not enough. The learning management system and the technology access of your system, I would equate them largely to the ramps and elevators that we have traditionally insisted be in place in order to provide access to the general classroom on campus. The ramps and elevators get a student with a disability to the class. It doesn't necessarily mean they will have access to what goes on in that class. The example we've always used is the student in a wheelchair who can make it to the chemistry lab, but when he gets there, the lab tables are so high that he can't do anything. Having the appropriate technology and having things appropriately coded, that's the architecture. The learning management system is the architecture of our online environment. and it's got to be there first, but it is only the first step, and we'll talk about some of the other pieces that go with it. Making online learning accessible to students with disabilities takes a team effort. It's not something that can be done by the tech support people. It's not something that can be done by the disability services folks. It's not something that can be done by the faculty who are creating the lessons that go up online. All of them will have to be involved together to make this work. Let's talk about a couple of pieces that fit in around the idea of making lessons accessible. Functional limitations is a term that disability services providers have been using for many years to try and figure out what it is that needs to happen in order for this particular student to be able to fully access what's going on in a classroom. When we talk about functional limitations, we're not concerned with the diagnosis so much as we are with the impact of the disability on the way the individual proceeds. So, for example, a student who is blind has the functional limitation of not being able to see the screen. That person also will not be available or will not be able to read a standard textbook. And remember, most academic classes online still have textbooks attached to them. If the individual is blind, they may not be able to surf the web as easily as the non-blind individual, because even if everything in your learning management system is fully accessible and your faculty have done everything they could to post things in an accessible fashion, the student who is blind may be able to reach the LMS, to reach the class website with no problems whatsoever. But if the first assignment is to go out and do a web search for the history of the Crimean War, you can't be sure that every website that that student is going to have to go to will also be accessible. So when we look at functional limitations, we look at how does the typical student perform, or what is required, what are the expectations for the typical student in the class, and how will this individual's functional limitations interfere. For a student who is deaf, the issue certainly is going to be, well, what about their ability to hear what is being said if you've got a narrated PowerPoint, or if you're sending them to look at a YouTube video, or whatever the audio components may be. Keep in mind that sometimes we build bells and whistles, literally and figuratively, into lessons specifically because they help to organize the information and make it easier for students to recognize when they've made a mistake. Think how often you hear that little beep go off that says you've got a new email. When we have students who do not have hearing available to them, then the functional limitation is they can't hear what the rest of us hear. So that's the impact. We've got to find a way around those issues. Assistive technology, that's a whole session in and of itself. And in a little while I'm going to give you some examples of how assistive technology interacts. But recognize that assistive technology for students with disabilities in online activities is more than just a screen reader or a text-to-speech application. And for those of you who don't know, there is a very significant difference between a screen reader, which reads absolutely everything on the screen. Screen readers are generally used by people who are blind or have such low vision that they really cannot effectively get anything off the screen independently. And so they use a screen reader that reads everything, including the navigation bar, including the directions that are given. They don't have the option of skipping around because they can't see to place the cursor. So the screen reader reads everything. It is more powerful in that it does read everything, including hidden code. It is less flexible because it reads everything from the top and keeps on going. A text-to-speech application will read only what the individual highlights and wants to have read to them. So you can go to a page and have it read for you only the segment that you've asked for or the frame that you're looking at. Text-to-speech applications are more often used by individuals with learning disabilities or attention problems who find that having the sound along with reading helps them to concentrate. Sometimes it's by people who find the act of reading on the screen to be very fatiguing. Text-to-speech applications are for people who get to pick and choose what they want to have read aloud to them, but it's a very different thing than a speech reader. Okay, briefly, very briefly, universal design of learning. The concept of universal design actually grew out of the concept of universal design as applied to architecture. The concept was first created by a gentleman named Ron Mace from North Carolina, who in the mid-'80s, he was an architect, he was also a wheelchair user, and he envisioned a world where we had a built and accessible environment. In other words, he suggested that as we build and as we design the environment, we think about all the people who are out there and build in accessibility as much as is possible rather than adding it on as an afterthought. You see the benefit of Ron Mace's vision on a daily basis in your everyday life. If you look at the handle of the door to your office, if you look at the handle of the door to your office, if you find that you have a lever handle instead of a doorknob, that's one of the first and most classic elements of universal design. For many people with disabilities, it is difficult to grip and turn a door handle. Those levers provide lots of different ways to open a door. Curb cuts, ramps leading into buildings that are not as a side note but are in fact perfectly evident and easy to have. Elevators. Elevators even in a 1- or 2-story building are a form of universal design because while they may be necessary for people with some disabilities to get there, they are useful for everyone universally. Universal design of learning plays off of that idea and suggests that as we look at designing our lessons, as we look at the online environment in our case, we try to make sure that as we plan, we recognize that there may be people with disabilities who will be accessing these lessons, and we make sure that everyone will have access to everything as much as possible at the same time. Okay, elements of online access that make a difference. If a student can't see the screen or read the text, what can I do about it? As a faculty member, it is helpful if you sit back and look at your course as you have laid it out for everyone to use, to experience, and say, how much of this is done by having the individual read it or experience it through their eyes? If I couldn't see, what options would there be for my having access to this material? Well, if I've got a screen reader, then I could hear it. Have I got everything set up so that I could hear it? What about those pictures? What am I going to hear when I get to the pictures? And we'll show you that in just a minute. The idea is that you look at how the typical student uses their eyes and then think about what steps you can take to make sure that someone who is using an alternative can still have full access. If the student can't hear the audio portion of my presentation or lesson, what can I do about it? There are a number of ways that you can provide backup for the audio, and the two most common and most commonly known would be to provide some kind of a script that provided the audio portion in a print format, or captioning. We've seen captioning on TV shows for ages now, and news, and last night I was watching the Olympics, and they have the Olympics being captioned so that you can watch it from across the room and still see what's going on, and still, even if you can't hear it, you can still see what's going on and what's being said. Those two options are a good way of dealing with not being able to hear what is typically presented. It's important to recognize that whether you're talking about hearing or seeing what's there, sometimes the option in online education may be to consider an alternate way of presenting the information. Whether it's presented in an alternate format for everybody or just for the student with a disability, the question is the typical way you do things the only way it could be done, or are there alternatives? That's part of universal design. What if the student can't follow my organization? What can I do about it? Are there ways that you can provide some structure that the student may be having difficulty with on their own? And here, again, we're talking about students with learning disabilities and students with attention deficit disorders, which are the two largest segments of students currently enrolled in higher education, students with disabilities. What is there that you can do in terms of organizing your lessons that will help those students as they go along? And the answer is there are some things in terms of providing information in a consistent fashion that may help provide a structure that they don't normally have, that they can't impose on themselves. So how does SoftChalk's Lesson Builder help with all of this? I'm going to dump out of here for the moment and call up for you a lesson I prepared for today that will demonstrate for you to a certain extent how SoftChalk has accessibility features built in. SoftChalk is a tool for authoring online lessons. And right now you are looking at the authoring mode for SoftChalk, meaning this is the place where I get to go in and change things, and where I put in the pretty boxes and the pictures, and I can put together the text pop-ups like you'll see here, and I'm going to show you what they look like when they're active later on. But in the authoring mode, there are all sorts of things that I can do that will make a difference in terms of organization. For example, this title, How SoftChalk Makes Accessibility Easy. In putting together the overlay, Steve, help me, what's the word I'm looking for, the properties.
When I lay out
the style, thank you very much. When I'm putting together the style, I decided that I wanted heading number 2 to be in blue and in this size print. And all I had to do was type in how SoftChalk makes accessibility easy and then put it at heading number 2, which was fine and it was easy, but it in fact is a function, or it adds to the functionality of the lesson later on for somebody who's using a screen reader, because the screen reader does not differentiate between type styles and fonts and colors that are just typed in, but it will read the heading differently if I've coded it as a heading. So we've already hit one element of accessibility that's built into the system. You'll notice this box that I have here that talks about SoftChalk and what it provides. That box was entered as a table, and when I put it together, I'm going to show you the part of the authoring. When I decided I wanted to put this quote in a box, I went into the table and I said, okay, give me a single cell or a single line, a single column, and I want it to be 65% of the width of what I'm doing, and I want it aligned in the center, and give me some padding around the outside and make the border of a width of 4, give it to me in blue, and then this is the exciting part. See the second tab that says accessibility? When I go into that tab, it gives me the option of putting something into the system that will automatically be available to somebody using a screen reader. In this particular case, what I put into the system is exactly what you read here. This whole paragraph that says SoftChalk software provides da-da-da, that information was entered into that little box in the accessibility menu. When a screen reader hits a table, the table is entered essentially as an image. And without that underneath portion, that what's called an alt tag, that is underneath the image, when the screen reader got to this whole big box, the screen reader would say image, and then it would go on to the next line. Now, because I've put this in underneath in an alt tag, what the screen reader will read is exactly what you are seeing on the screen, because it was entered in such a way, and you saw how easy it is to enter in to make that possible. SoftChalk also gives you the opportunity of putting in text poppers. And if you look here, it shows you that I entered in exactly the information that I want to pop up when we go to an active mode in just a moment. And I get to choose whether I want it to stick around or how big I want it, etc. But the fact is that built into the text poppers is the ability for the screen reader to read that as it goes by. So it's already there. It's already available. If we move down a little bit, and again, see where it says some more examples, you will notice if you look up in the menu, that's a heading number 3. It's there for a reason, and again, it helps with the organization, it helps with what the screen reader sees, but it was done automatically simply by using the system, and yet its being there is a piece of access that is terribly important. There are descriptions of images that are available that you can embed in the code, and I wanted to give you at least one image, and this is my favorite cartoon of all the things I've found lately. The computer says I have to upgrade my brain to be compatible with its new software. Now, those of you listening today and watching today presumably can see that picture and read that caption for yourself. If I were using a screen reader, when I got to that image, all I would hear is image unless something was done. But in our case, something was done. So if I go up here and show you what I did, excuse me, this is for putting in an image rather than putting in a table. I get to select the image that I want, which I've already done, and it tells me whether the quality is good, and I can optimize it. And I tell it where I want it, and I tell if I want a border around it. And then it gives me a chance to put in alternative text and a long description. And I will show you in a minute what that shows up as. But what that means is that for the individual using a screen reader, I can, as part of the system, name that image. I named this one Shock to the System. And then I can give an audio description of what the picture is. So in this particular case, let me back it up here. In this particular case, my description says, a picture of two horrified figures glancing up at the heavens. The caption reads, the computer says I have to upgrade my brain to be compatible with its new software. Now, the individual who is using a screen reader has exactly the same access to any intent or importance, if it is important, of that image as those of us who can see it as we look at it. Okay, you've seen some of the backup in terms of how these things are entered in the authoring mode.
Before you go into
ahead.
that, can you hear me? There's a couple of
Yes.
questions that come up that I think maybe it's appropriate to try to get the answer to that.
Okay.
There's some questions about the table you created and whether or not you just shouldn't have used the table at all. And in fact, you know, and I responded in the Q&A that this was just an example. Sometimes tables are really very important. It's a very good way of organizing information. In the case you showed, it really wasn't necessary, but it was a good example of how tables can be used.
And I wanted to show that when you build a table, you can put the text right there under it as part of the authoring.
And then somebody, Maureen asked, would the screen reader read the table correctly? I thought they were an issue. And I think you pretty much went over that, although she may have missed the details of that. You may want to sort of reinforce that, that element.
The screen reader doesn't read the table as I've entered it. The screen reader reads the alt text. It reads what I put underneath the table. It's not something that you and I can see, but in fact, everything that's in the little box, you should see me sitting on my side pointing to the box on my screen. Everything that's in the little box is also in the alt tag, in the coding that is underneath, and it will be read in total by the screen reader because I told it to.
Right. The other thing they talked about was when you enter the alt text in the table, they said it looks like all you got was the question mark, and I pointed out that the entire text was in there. We just saw the little scrolling box, and we only saw the end of it.
Right. That's correct.
Okay. And there's a question about, okay, well, and okay, there's additional questions about how could table with numbers and columns be read using the screen reader? And I expect you have to enter alternate code for each element of the box of the table.
The answer to that is actually, whereas we tend to think about everything old is new again because it's now all online, the issue of how you make information in a table or an image available to somebody using a screen reader is really not a lot different than the issue of how we make it available to anybody who who is listening to something read. You folks may be familiar with Recordings for the Blind and Dyslexic, which has for over 50 years, I believe, been providing audio versions of print materials. When their professional readers are reading those audio materials onto a tape, or in this day and age into some kind of digital format, when they hit a table, they have a system worked out as to how they describe everything that is in that table so that somebody who is listening rather than viewing it can understand what's in the table. We've had the capabilities, we've had the system for some time. Is it easy? For those of us who are used to looking at the table, it'd probably be difficult to follow. But if you are used to picturing those things in your mind because that's all you have available to you, then a well-defined audio description of what you're viewing will be the best that can be done. And everything in that well-defined audio description that I could say if I was describing it to you out loud can be put in text and entered into that alt tag underneath.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop interrupting you because you've got a lot more to say. There's some other questions,
That's
but
fine.
Let's deal with them at the end.
All right, very good. Let's go back to the learner view. This is the same information you were just looking at when I was in the authoring view, but now this is what your students would see. And there are some elements here. First of all, the style. All of my lessons look the same. They all have the same logo. They've all got the same color scheme and that kind of thing. On the right-hand side, I have a chance to put in what's on this page, and it would take me automatically to the things that are there. Those elements of consistency in terms of how things are shown are critical for somebody who is having trouble with organization to be able to rely on some things consistently. So if you put up a dozen lessons in as many weeks and they all have the same structure, they all come in the same way, and they all have the page numbers and the page navigation in the same place, and they all have this kind of information on the side, that really does help somebody who's got organizational issues to know what to expect and how to process the information. Now, again, this title that we put in a heading number 3, it looks just the same as it did before to those of us who can see the screen, but it will sound differently to somebody who is listening to this through a screen reader. It will say, heading, SoftChalk makes accessibility easy, and then it will say text, and it'll go on from there, or something along those lines, depending on how it's set up. But it tells them this is important. This is different than what you're seeing in general. If you look at the box, which, again, I entered as a table just to make a point, if you look at the box, you'll find that it looks just fine. It looks like boxed text to those of us who can see it. But by entering it in the way that it was, it will also sound just the same to somebody who is listening to what's being said. The text pop-ups show up when I am in the learner mode. You may have seen it kind of flash by because I can see what I put in when I'm in authoring mode, but this is what it looks like in the learner mode, and it pops up and it's available as they go by. And then when we get down here, this is that cartoon that we looked at, and it looks just the same to you and I as it did in the authoring mode, and it is there for your students to view that picture as we go along. But I put this in as a text popper just to show you. Shock to the system, a picture of 2 horrified figures glancing up, and so on. It doesn't need to be a text popper for those of us who can see it. I put that there to show you that that is exactly what I put underneath this picture, so that when the screen reader got to the cartoon, that information is exactly what the screen reader would read to them. That's what they would know about the picture that they're seeing. They haven't missed anything. One more thing that I had forgotten that I put in here that I think is important to know is that you can also insert documents into the lesson as you go along in a very simple fashion using a hyperlink kind of thing. Just as you can link the lesson directly to some other place online, you can also link it to a Word document or some other document that you have created. Now, for students under typical circumstances, you may want to do that because that's the handout that you're giving them. You can link it as if it were a handout, and they've got something that they should print off and go from there. But because you can enter documents, you can also enter scripts. So one of the things that you could do, if, for example, you had a PowerPoint presentation, a narrated PowerPoint presentation. Let me see, wait a minute. I complicated this for myself. I can enter a script in there for that narrated PowerPoint just by highlighting something and adding in the link. And for that deaf student, when they get to the PowerPoint, they're going to not be able to hear what's said, but lo and behold, right next to where you've mounted the PowerPoint, you have a script. And please note, see at the top here, the content from the PowerPoint slides are shown in italics and in red. The narration accompanying each slide is in black. I did it that way purposely so that for someone who is deaf, they can see what the slide said, and they can see the information that was spoken out loud as each slide came up, so that they're not looking at the script separate from the slides and trying to figure out what went with which thing. Now, interestingly, while this was put together in this way, in the context of making up for a person who is deaf who cannot hear that narrated PowerPoint, it may be that for a student who is blind, using the script with the appropriately coded headings, etc., that this may be an easier way for them to follow a PowerPoint as well. Unless you're reading straight off of your PowerPoint all of the time, the individual who is blind may not be able to see the screen even though they can hear what you're saying about it. I've now given them a script that includes both the information on the screen and the information that is spoken, and they can have their screen reader read all of that to them at once. Okay, Steve, are there any questions about this part before we go back to the other?
I think we are. Well, there's a lot of questions, so I don't even.
All right. Well, then let me.
The questions.
Let me finish up what I'm doing here, and then we'll take some of those questions.
Okay.
Okay. Let me get back to my PowerPoint real quick and give you one more slide. In the promotional information for this seminar, it talked about a virtual open house where you could get some more information. This is my chance to plug a new online training package from Disability Compliance and Career and Online Learning. We have mounted 10 training modules to a single website, and they train all key personnel and key institutional players in one place. In other words, rather than training being directed to faculty about access or to disability services folks about access or to administrators or tech support folks, these training modules are interconnected and they are targeted to different audiences. So the people from tech support don't have to listen to all the stuff that the disability services people really need to hear, and vice versa. They can go in and look at just the training modules that are pertinent to them. Next week, from February 22nd to 24th, which is Monday through Wednesday, we're having a virtual open house. And if you go to the website shown there, you can enter the training modules and tour our facility to your heart's content. And then there'll be more information available as to how your institution can subscribe to the website so that more folks will have a chance to access the information that's there. And if you need a little bit more information, you can always visit us at our own website at www.dccol.net. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn the screen back over to you, Steve.
Okay, well, what I'm going to do is launch another poll. There was some question about what it was the first poll did about accessibility. So this poll actually gives a much more general question about providing accessibility training in your area. And there's one more thing I want to show you. So I'm going to take over the screen. And when you get back from the poll, I will be showing you one more thing, and then we'll get to all the Q&A. So just give you one more moment, and then I will close the poll. Okay, most of you have voted, and the results are interesting. Closing the poll. Come on, there you go. And let's share the results of the poll. And you'll see that 60% are saying yes, that there is some accessibility training in your organization. So that's the good news. The bad news is that there's the other 40%. All right, I'm going to hide these results, and that will show my screen. One of the things that Jane did not talk about was the learning activities and the quizzes that are part of SoftChalk. And I just want to show you one example. This is a learning activity called a hotspot. And hotspots are learning activities, and there's about a dozen of them in SoftChalk, create flash objects. Well, flash objects are not readily accessible. But what SoftChalk does is it uses the international standard for this keyhole to say that there's an alternative accessible activity content. Notice that it says that when you roll
Steve,
over
I'm not seeing that on my screen.
Oh, you're right. I haven't shown my screen. Now
there
you should
go.
be able to do it. Okay.
Very good.
Thank you, Jane. And you can see this is the hotspot flash activity, one of our learning activities. This keyhole is the international standard for accessibility, and there's an alternative website, web page, and this is it. It says, and it's automatically created. You don't have to do anything more than create that learning activity, and all the information that you automatically put in is already there. So the blind student would know what the content was. As a matter of fact, you can add additional information if you want. And so I just wanted to make that point in the hotspot. This is how hotspot works, in case you're not sure. You roll over an area, and it defines what is there. So having said that, I will go and I'm going to turn it back over to Jane, because I think the questions you have will relate to Jane's questions. And I'm going to go back to the Q&A and talk about some of the questions you've had. Some of the questions dealt with styles. You know, SoftChalk has these styles that you can create, and the question was, do you need additional? Did you need to customize the styles that SoftChalk creates in any way?
Okay, you're looking at my screen, which shows the authoring mode.
Yes, we are.
Okay, if you go up here under Properties, there is a space that says Style Properties. And you can go in and you can build whatever you want. And there are a number of choices that are available to you that you can use. You can create your own. I am one of those people who appreciates the fact that because it's SoftChalk, it is easy. And so I picked one that was already in place. But you do have options as far as the styles that you use.
There's a question about fonts being used in tables and numbers being used in tables when you're creating a math lesson, and how any of that would work.
There are some font styles that are more readily visible by people who have low vision. In other words, one of the reasons that in the lessons that I build, I generally use font styles with serif versus sans serif, something like Arial or something, is because they are more easily visible by somebody who has some visual problems. As far as the screen reader is concerned, they don't read font one way or another. They don't even read size of font one way or another. So for the screen readers, it wouldn't make a difference. For individuals who have other kinds of problems, attention problems, or who have low vision, etc., how you create information, how you put it up may make a difference. And there are lots of good sources out there that will give you information about how best to build a Word document, what kinds of fonts are usable and useful, etc. I would suggest you simply do a Google search for accessibility of online accessibility or creating accessibility online, something along those lines, and it'll give you a number of good websites that talk about the technical aspects of those things.
Okay, good answer. couple of questions from Catherine. Can a screen reader read the table of contents that appears when your mouse rolls over the contents on a page? And does the pop-up get read as a pop-up or somehow in line with the text itself?
Okay, let's go back to this mode. The table of contents, oh, I didn't have it here. On this page thing, the screen reader will read what's in the, again, I'm gesturing with my hand here. You can't see that. The screen reader will read what's in this frame first, and then it will move over and read the other frame. So it will read those things. As long as you keep it going, it will eventually get to those things. And it will be able to read them aloud. And learning to use a screen reader effectively is a skill in and of itself. And individuals who are blind, you know, it's not like you can see the screen or you can't. There are even ranges within that, so that somebody who has some vision and can see the layout of your slide but can't read the text that's there may be able to position their cursor in some way. There's lots of different ways to read a screen reader that make it more useful for the individual as they go along. As far as the pop-ups are concerned, I believe, I'm not sure, Steve, do you know how those are read?
I think they're read in line, but
I think they are as well.
I'm not really sure.
I believe that's true.
Okay, question. Can you create narration which also highlights text, which is another, how do you highlight text within a narration?
Meaning create narration within SoftChalk that will highlight text? Is that the question?
Well, I think what narration may be a funny choice of words. What I originally read that to mean is when you create an alternate way of reading information, the PowerPoint or whatever, can you also actually, within the context of a SoftChalk lesson, how do you highlight text? How do you make it so that people say, oh, I want to read that first?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question, but again, if you have used headings to decide, let me go back to the authoring mode. If you have set off the pieces of what you're doing with various headings, then when you get into the view mode, those headings show up over here on mine on the sidebar, and you can go directly to those. So if you go directly to some more examples, it takes you directly to that piece. If you could use your headings to help navigate around the screen.
Right, but the text, if you bold it or you make it in red, the screen reader doesn't see that.
That's correct. The screen reader does not see bold or italics or colors at all.
Okay, so you need to do some extra work. So one of the questions that came up was about people with color blindness, and what do you do about that? And you need, if color is important, you simply need to include that as alternate text information.
Correct. Or if there are some excellent resources out there. Try, again, feed into your Google search, creating an accessible Word document. There are specific instructions that are given about how to structure the content of what you're doing so that it will be more usable by folks. And you can get that information online from a number of different sources. One of the best is Kansas State. It's called K-State Access. Those folks have done a wonderful job of providing information for their faculty about specifically how they can improve the accessibility of the materials they're creating.
We're running short on time, and I really want to not take more of people's time than we promised, an hour. Let me see that thing. Something last minute. Oh, a couple things. One, a couple of people asked if this is being recorded, and yes, it will, and it will be on our website probably tomorrow. You'll also get an email from us, and in that email, I will ask Jane to send me those links she provided at the very end about the open house, so I will include those links in the email you will be getting. And the last question is, will your slides be available? How could they can they get a copy of your slides, and how?
Well, the slides will be available as part of the presentation when it's mounted to your website, right?
Well, they will have to view the presentation.
I am more than happy to send you that PowerPoint if you've got a way of mounting that along with the seminar.
If people want that, at the very end, and I'm going to take back the presenter. I will show your email, and they will have that. Also, your email will be in that final.
Again, Steve, I can't see your. Oh, there we go.
In the final email that I send out to everyone who's attended, you will also get Jane's email address. So if there's additional information you want from her, want to just chat with her, you'll have that information available. So I'll try to include as much information as you need in order to follow up in that final email, which will be going out tomorrow. Hopefully the archive of the webinar will be up by then, so all that information will be included. What I want to do is I want to just close with telling you a few things about how you can find out more information. Since many of you have not seen SoftChalk before, I invite you to come to our weekly webinar series in which we talk all about SoftChalk. And today's session, Innovators in Online Learning, was a special accessibility session that Jane kindly did for us, and we're going to be doing these sessions quarterly with her. And so I invite you to watch the archives of the other, because it's everything from student advising to dealing with students with learning disabilities. There's huge amounts of information out there. If you're a client, we provide short courses, 1 hour on individual parts of SoftChalk so that you can get online training without any problem. We provide group training webinars, and we come on site to do training as well. If you're kind of just-in-time kind of learner, you have a question, we have a bunch of flash videos that describe the various content, and we have extraordinary documentation and a great FAQ and a wonderful help desk as well. We are currently evaluating the latest in our lesson challenge. We got like 80 submissions last year and almost 70 this year of really excellent content created by our clients. And if you want to see what amazing things have been done with SoftChalk, just visit our website and view the completed lessons. And matter of fact, let me show you what our website looks like. So you go to this demo area, and all the things I just talked about in terms of looking at lessons are there. If you want to get training, you can go to this tab. And finally, if you want more information about us, you can get hold of our sales support team at this, using this information. If you have a question for me, get hold of me that way. But I think most of you, if you want some additional information or want to contact Jane, and that is her email address, so please contact her there. Jane, a really extraordinary session. I loved it, and I want to thank you for doing it, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you all for coming.